Big Shaq notices 90-year-old pushing carts to afford food, then does the unthinkable. The sun was just beginning to rise over a quiet neighborhood in Atlanta, casting its warm glow over the early morning commuters. It was that perfect time of day when the world was still waking up. The grocery store parking lot was nearly empty except for a few early shoppers and workers just starting their shift. The sound of carts rattling and the hum of an old motorized floor cleaner echoed through the lot. A black SUV pulled into a parking spot near the store entrance. It looked like any other vehicle, but as the door opened, the unmistakable silhouette of Shaquille O'Neal stepped out, towering above the cars around him. Big Shaq, as everyone called him, was known for being larger than life, not just because of his height, but also because of his big personality and big heart. Shaq rarely had time for mundane errands, especially with his busy schedule full of TV appearances, sponsorships, and charity work. But today he had a rare gap in his day, and he thought it would be nice to pick up some things for himself. As he stepped out of the car, he stretched, enjoyed the briskness of the morning air. But just as Shaq started towards the store, something caught his eye. An elderly man, maybe in his 90s, was struggling to push a long row of shopping carts towards the docking area. He leaned heavily into the metal carts, his frail frame nearly lost in the oversized store uniform he wore. His face, deeply wrinkled with age, was flushed with effort, and despite the morning chill, sweat dotted his brow. Shaq paused, watching the man for a moment. He could tell right away that this wasn't someone just helping out. The man's worn employee badge said it all. This was his job. For a moment, Shaq's heart sank. Here was a man, likely someone who had worked hard his entire life, now having to push carts to get by. Shaq approached, his deep voice gentle as he called out, "Hey, you need some help, big fella?" The old man looked up, startled at first, but his eyes softened when he saw the kind face of the giant before him. He smiled weakly. "I'm okay, son. Just doing my job." Shaq shook his head, a sense of admiration mixed with sadness building in his chest. "You work here?" The old man nodded, straightening up a bit. "Been here a couple years now. Helps me pay for some groceries." Shaq introduced himself, extending his hand. "I'm Shaq. What's your name, sir?" "Name's Earl," the elderly man said with a chuckle, shaking Shaq's hand. "I know who you are. You're that basketball fella." Shaq smiled, but his mind was racing. Earl was out here pushing carts. And for what? To put food on the table. Something about that just didn't sit right. He could see the tiredness in Earl's eyes, a kind of tiredness that spoke of years of struggling and resilience. Shaq glanced at the carts and then back at Earl. "Earl, if you didn't have to be out here, what would you be doing instead?" Earl chuckled, the sound tinged with sadness. "I'd probably be fishing, to be honest, or reading some books. My wife used to love those mystery novels, and I always said I'd start reading them with her. Never got around to it. But life's got other plans sometimes." Shaq felt a pang in his chest. He nodded, giving Earl a smile before turning and walking into the store. But as he grabbed a shopping basket and began picking up his items, eggs, some milk, a few protein bars, he couldn't stop thinking about Earl. Here was a man who had probably spent his entire life working, only to end up here, struggling just to make ends meet. It wasn't right. Shaq picked up 2 breakfast sandwiches from the hot food section, along with 2 cups of steaming coffee. As he paid for his items, he made up his mind. He couldn't just walk away and leave Earl out there. Moments later, Shaq walked back outside. Earl was still there, aligning the carts in their docking station, moving slowly, deliberately. "Earl?" Shaq called, holding up the bag and coffees. "Got a minute?" Earl looked up, squinting, and smiled when he saw Shaq coming over. "Oh, you didn't have to do that," Earl said, his voice touched with gratitude. "I did," Shaq said, smiling back. "Come on, let's sit for a bit." Earl hesitated for a moment, but eventually nodded. They walked over to a bench near the front of the store, shaded by a small tree. Shaq handed Earl one of the coffees and a breakfast sandwich. "Thank you," Earl said softly, as he unwrapped the sandwich. "I wasn't expecting this." "No problem, Earl. Shaq said, taking a sip of his coffee. I figured we could chat for a bit. If you're not too busy, that is. Earl laughed dryly. Busy? Nah, they just have me move carts around for a few hours. It's part-time work. Shaq looked at him thoughtfully. Earl, why do you work here? Earl took a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly as he seemed to consider the question. Finally, he sighed. Worked at a factory most of my life. Was good work. Decent pay. Had a retirement plan I was counting on. But then my wife got sick. Cancer. Medical bills ate up everything we had. Sold the house. Burned through all our savings. After she passed, I didn't have much left. Social Security helps, but it ain't enough for rent, utilities, and medicine. So I took this job just to keep my head above water. Shaq frowned, his coffee untouched in his hands. He looked at Earl, humbled by his resilience. That's not right, Earl. No one should have to go through that. Especially not after a lifetime of hard work. Earl just shrugged, a faint smile on his face. Life's life, son. You make do. Shaq nodded, but inside he felt a growing determination. He wasn't going to leave it at that. Earl, Shaq said after a long pause. Do you have any family? Kids? Anyone to help out? Earl shook his head. No kids. My wife and I wanted them, but it just never happened. Most of my family's gone now. It's just me. Shaq sighed, as though coming to a decision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, taking out a small stack of crisp bills. Hundreds. Earl's eyes widened as Shaq placed the money on the bench between them. Earl, I want you to take this, Shaq said firmly. Use it for your bills, get some groceries, and get whatever you need. Earl stared at the money, then looked back at Shaq, his eyes filled with shock and confusion. I can't take this, son. It's too much. I can't. You can, and you will, Shaq said, smiling gently. Look, Earl, I've been blessed. I've got more money than I could ever spend. And it's not about keeping it all to myself. It's about helping out people when I can. You've worked hard your whole life. Let me help you out. Earl hesitated, his hands trembling slightly, as he glanced at the money, then back at Shaq. I don't even know how to thank you for something like this. Shaq shook his head, his warm smile. You don't need to thank me, Earl. But I do have one condition. Earl blinked, caught off guard. Shaq grinned. You've got to promise me you'll work less. Enjoy your life, Earl. You've earned it. And one more thing. You've got to take me fishing sometime. You said you'd love it, and I've never been. Earl chuckled, despite the tears welling up in his eyes. You've got yourself a deal, Shaq. Shaq nudged the money closer to him. Good. Now take it, and do something for yourself. You deserve it. With shaky hands, Earl finally picked up the stack of bills, holding it like it might vanish at any moment. He looked up at Shaq, his voice breaking. Thank you, son. You don't know what this means to me. Shaq smiled, standing up. I think I do, Earl. Now, go get that book you were talking about. A good mystery, something your wife would have liked. And remember, you're not alone. Earl nodded, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his uniform. You've given me more than money today, Shaq. You've given me hope. Shaq patted him on the shoulder. That's all I wanted, Earl. Now go get that book and don't forget about our fishing trip. As Shaq walked back to his car, Earl watched, his heart swelling with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. He clutched the money in his hand, almost afraid to put it away, as if the moment might disappear if he did. Thank you, Shaq, Earl called out, his voice cracking. God bless you. Shaq turned, giving Earl a small wave and a big smile. See you soon, Earl. Earl sat quietly on the bench, watching as Shaq's car pulled out of the lot and disappeared down the street. For the first time in a long time, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The constant worry about bills, rent and food, for the first time he felt like he could breathe. He leaned back against the bench, the warm morning sun touching his face. He thought of his wife, the love of his life, and smiled. He could almost hear her voice, gentle and loving, telling him not to worry, that everything was going to be okay. "It's over now, sweetheart," Earl whispered. "I'm going to be okay. I'm going to live." What do you think Earl's late wife would say if she knew he could finally live peacefully? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.